My name's Mark Schaefer. I'm the National Climate Change Policy Advisor for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm your moderator for this session. And we have Heidi West, who is the facilitator for this session. There are two speakers. The first one is Dennis Fig. He's going to talk to us about completing a habitat system for the country. And then I'm going to talk with you all about an effort called the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy, and some of the implications of what we learned in putting that strategy together that might affect our ability to complete a habitat system for the United States. I'm not big on formal introductions. Fortunately, neither is Dennis. Dennis is a friend of a long time and a colleague. I assume he's a reputable biologist because the state of Missouri continues to pay him. He is the Wildlife Program Director for the Missouri Department of Conservation, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Dennis.
Thank you. Some of the key core messages I was coming to give you today, I've heard others say, and I have to tell you, that doesn't bother me a bit. It's real affirming that others are seeing that there's some key messages that we all relate to. I'm happy to be here today to talk about habitat conservation and the fact that we already have a habitat network across the nation. What we know is that it's not rigorous enough to sustain all the fish, wildlife, and forest resources that we want. In the face of climate change, it's going to be even more challenging. So it's not like we're starting anything, but can we build on what we have in more concerted ways so that we work together more effectively for a rigorous network of lands and waters? Well, to state the obvious, we should all be deeply concerned about the decline of our nation's fish, wildlife habitats. Interesting that when we start looking at fish and wildlife that are declining around us, we know that we look at aquatic systems. If you look at fish, mussels, and crayfish together, they clearly say that our aquatic systems are threatened to a more degree than many of the other systems out there. And yet, when we get together in forums like this, we are very weak on what are the aquatic systems and how do we relate to them. So fish, wildlife, and plants, including things like this neosho tom. The other thing is, it's not just a species of greatest conservation need. And to some degree, you know about the state wildlife action plans, and this program grew out of that national conservation planning effort. And yet, it isn't really just simply about those species of greatest conservation need. But even species like this chickadee, which are common today, how do we ensure that they're there in the future in viable populations? And the other thing that's really important to be thinking about is too often we're not focused on those diverse community associations, those places that are producing viable, diverse wildlife, and we hope that they will be in the future. And it's really, that's where our focus must be. And so my guidance to the whole conservation community is to focus on landscapes valuable to fish and wildlife. One of the things I was a part of this last 5 years was the Wildlife and Habitat Policy Research Program made possible by the Duke Charitable Trust. And the purpose of that was to say, what must we be doing in the future to build on that existing network of lands and waters valuable to fish and wildlife? The Wildlife and Habitat Research Program was organized to improve our information and our tools to accelerate wildlife habitat conservation in the United States in order to complete a wildlife habitat system for the nation. Yeah, that says a lot, but it's not anything that this whole entire group can't relate to. The person who pulled that program together, Mark Schaefer, happens to be here. He was rather strategic in a team of people he pulled together, people who represent state agencies, federal agencies, private industry, thinkers, economists, a small team of people to wrestle with what's it going to take? What must, what are some of the strategic research questions about our vision for a habitat system for the nation? And I love the different vision statements, and I think they can play powerful roles here. The one that we build our thinking around, and we want to think translates readily to this group, is our vision of a wildlife habitat system for the nation is a sufficient and comprehensive connected habitat network of lands and waters, from the inner city to the wilderness, and the resources to manage it. And we are aware as we built our program that the resources to management are a different question than we tried to answer with our research. A very compelling question, but probably not one that we were going to wrestle with. Although our nation has made important strides in fish and wildlife conservation over the past century, it's been common to manage only for single species and to act only when species become threatened with extinction. Our nation lacks an integrated and effective approach to protecting, managing, and restoring fish and wildlife habitats. You know, a wildlife system for the nation is really, in its simplest form, just an exercise in strategic thinking. Where are we now? Where do we want to be in the future? How will we get there? That is really what we were challenged to work on. We have a network now. It is not particularly rigorous to sustain future fish and wildlife. That's where we are now. Where do we want to be in the future? Well, we desire a network of lands and waters resilient in the face of climate change. And I really appreciated Bruce Stein's comment yesterday to use resilience in a broad, inclusive term that includes looking forward. And finally, how do we get there? Well, and isn't that really what we're all about here? How must we get there? What's the role of science and policy and collaborations in moving us forward into a rigorous network of lands and waters that produce fish and wildlife into the future? These are some of the questions, strategic questions that we sought to fund research to answer. Costs. How much land is needed and how much will it cost? Benefits. What ecosystem services are from conserved lands? Effectiveness. How much funding is available across sectors for habitat conservation? Efficiency. What are the relative financial efficiencies of deeds, easements, and stewardship agreements? And finally, equity. What portion of the conservation bill is being paid by public versus private enterprise? Rather than go through these research results, today I want to share with you some key themes that I thought were relevant to this audience. But I really encourage you to go to the website. If you want to read any of these particular research projects that we did, that we funded, then you'll learn some particulars about that. Obviously, I'd be happy to answer any questions about those. But let's look at some other aspects of this. One of the motivating factors for pulling this program together was the first generation of state wildlife action plans. The first generation of wildlife action plans has become an important step in conserving fish and wildlife in a dramatically changing world. Never have scientists, conservationists, and communities come together on this scale to pursue common conservation goals. And while the state wildlife action plans are not habitat conservation plans, collectively they provide a nationwide strategy to prevent wildlife from becoming endangered. During our program, we recognized that this was only one framework to help us understand the way forward, but it was a really important moment in conservation history with a lot of moving parts, a really incredible collaboration that helped us come up with one version. And I think one of the expectations were that we would be able to link these up and see what that, some of the growth in that existing emerging habitat network might look like. And that's all we want to tell you that this is about. This is about looking at one growth period in time and what that represents. With the challenge from this program, I think, to say how do subsequent state wildlife action plans need to be different to further build on that habitat network. Instead, I want to talk about some important lessons, and again, you've heard some of these today. There are two important lessons we learned from the national planning experience, conservation planning experience called the State Wildlife Action Plans. The first is that wildlife habitat conservation must occur at the landscape scale. You know, I know that is just pretty much standard issue talk for everybody here. You know, 8 years ago when we were doing the wildlife action plans, I don't think people were talking. I don't think they were just saying that explicitly. Maybe some of you were, but as a community, we're now saying that. But clearly, that was one of these things that we learned. I mean, if you think about the little things in the landscape that we can all get caught up with, including this grasshopper that means a lot to me, but maybe not to you, we need to be thinking at a different scale. Landscape scale conservation requires a more sophisticated analysis of where we need to conserve land and new management strategies for adapting over time to issues such as land conversion and climate change. The kinds of data development we were doing 10 years ago or 20 years ago focused on individual species really are not necessarily the kinds of data management that move us forward together at a landscape scale. It does require incredible kinds of analysis that are being demonstrated here at this conference. A wildlife habitat system for the nation will require work by the broader conservation community, not just state and federal fish and wildlife agencies. Conservation partners are not only important for conservation delivery, but integral to conservation planning. And if you were at the North American recently and participated in the agency transformation workshop, Dan Decker made an observation about the state wildlife action planning experience. He said, it is the first time that we democratized conservation planning. And what he meant is that many states went to great effort to open the door of conservation planning. It wasn't just something that the conservation community and agency received and then said, how do we work on this together? But rather opened it widely in a different format to say, you can participate in conservation planning as well as conservation implementation. And truly, I think that's one of the strengths of the experience that we had and something we need to continue to build on. Well, what happens if we all start working together? What if we value the role that each of us as individuals and organizations, agencies play, and work, value on those, and empower those different levels so that we can build on that habitat network together? A sufficient and comprehensive connected habitat network of lands and waters will require expanded collaboration and partnerships across landscapes and jurisdictions. You know, a few years ago when we put this message together, it felt kind of like groundbreaking. You know, it was like, wow, this is deep. And you know, here today, this is not a particularly deep statement. I think one of the things I want to tell you is this statement preceded the emergence of landscape conservation cooperatives. That this is a need that we have, and that this conference says the landscape conservation cooperatives clearly can be part of the response to that need and maybe major leaders in that need. The collaboration for science may be part of that, but the collaboration for delivery may be different. And I'd like you to think about that a moment. The collaborations for science, who you pull together and the skills they have, very important, as we've demonstrated here. But we talk about then delivering the entire picture of conservation. The implementation part may require completely different collaboration. Perhaps the role of the LCCs is to be those people, the level of conservation that delivers the science, but then enables the implementation parts of our collaborations. A wildlife habitat system for the nation will require work by the broader conservation community, not just state fish and wildlife agencies. We can make that available to you. One of the things that this program funded was a white paper of sorts that Dan Decker and team prepared for the North American. And it talks about agency transformation. And even though the title of the workshop at the North American was Agency Transformation, when you start thinking about these transformational things that must happen, they go well beyond the state fish and wildlife agencies or the federal fish and wildlife agencies. They include the organizations represented here today. They represent all of us. And it's interesting to me that the collaboration that we have here for conservation and the science collaboration, one of the challenges is the part that we're not tending or maybe not quite ready to tend, which is the transformation our organizations we represent must make to make that possible. We think about some of the ways that they are not stepping up the plate in the way we want them to for this collaboration. It's because they have to transform into something different so they can participate in conservation in a new and different form. I initially was going to talk about, well, what are some specifics that state wildlife action plans need, specifically how they need to be different in the future, and specifically what are some potential things for LCCs. But I decided to go with an example. And I want to share one example with you from the lower Mississippi Valley. And I'll go through this rather quickly. I've never had to go through this quickly, but you guys are good, so we're going to do it. The place is the Mississippi River Alluvial Basin. And you see there a small graphic about where that geography is. It looks like this. Not real compelling for conservation. Historically, it was a forested landscape. The statistics for the conversion of what this landscape was, in terms of a big forest, wetland system, now is, I think they say 87% converted. In my part of the range, it's more like 97% of this habitat has converted to this. If you're into land cover, just for grins, all the brown is cropland. Historically, that would all been forest. So that's the level of transformation we're talking about. That area in red there is the priority place for bottomland forest restoration in this geography identified in the Missouri Comprehensive Wildlife Strategy. Doesn't look real promising, does it? Yeah. But it is the best option that we have, and we are moving forward with that. The biggest forest fragment is this state park out here. This is about 1,800 acres. So I share this for a number of reasons. One, this is a really good story of how we are moving forward on forest restoration. But the second thing is, not every place that we're working in really looks great today. I like the great pictures like they're not all like that. I want to tell you that most of the priority birds for this habitat need second growth or mature forest. I'll go through this rather quickly. Got to get from here to here to here to here. Before you can get to there, we need to get started. The guidance for what birds are important in this geography are from the Partners in Flight. Partners in Flight gives us really good guidance. This is the North American Land Bird Conservation Plan. And you're probably familiar with the bird conservation regions, and I'm down there in the yellow one, kind of down the center. That's the lower Mississippi Valley. And Partners in Flight tells us these are the priority breeding birds in the Mississippi alluvial basin. So if you look at these species, a couple of thoughts. One, the reason those two are blued out the top is because they're kind of showstoppers, probably not conservation actions. But I'd like you to look at the others because notice that Swainson's warbler and prothonotary warblers are pretty high up as priority species. They aren't necessarily listed on anybody's species of greatest conservation need list. But these are representatives of the system. And you look at this, prothonotary warblers, as far as they aren't listed in anybody's list, certainly not in this geography, they are a representative of the species that we need to be working on. I point out the lower Mississippi Valley joint venture here, same geography. Partners in Flight tells us who the birds are. Here's our partnership. The lower Mississippi Valley joint venture provides guidance on the size of forest blocks needed to sustain these target bird populations. Rather quickly, so in the top example, Swainson's warblers, if we go over to the other side, we need forest blocks of at least 10,000 acres to produce 500 pairs, some version of a viable population. And so we look at these groups of representative species that help us know the scale that we must operate at. The joint venture has graphically represented where we intend to go to work, laying out a vision for what is forest restoration, how might it be distributed in the future in the Mississippi alluvial basin. From this kind of vision, we can all, conservation partners, other agencies say, this is where we will go to work, at what scale, with what resources. Rather briefly, in Missouri, this geography is represented in the Comprehensive Wildlife Strategy. It's also represented in the Tennessee's Wildlife Action Plan. And what you see in this geography here is at the top, the River Bends project area, and the bottom, lower Obion project area, so that both of these action plans have identified this as the priority place. I know it's not a great functioning forest, but that's the vision before us. It's supported by the joint venture because it fits into a bigger framework of a larger restoration goal. The other thing I might point out is that this same geography is also identified in the Forest Action Plan in Missouri, and I didn't do my homework to find out if it's in the Forest Action Plan for Tennessee. So, and this is really what all this little story is about. In this example, Partners in Flight identifies the bird targets and sets the population objectives. The Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture identifies a vision for the habitat for these birds and offers guidance on the scale of action needed. The state strategies, Missouri and Tennessee, identify the best geographies for implementation, specifically where to go to be most successful, and this can also be bolstered by the Forest Action Plans. Implementation of this habitat conservation initiative will require collaboration with existing conservation partners, multiple state agencies, working in concert with federal agencies, and participating citizens and communities. The question for us is, well, what's the role of the Landscape Conservation Cooperative here? And I saw a lot of good examples coming up here, including one that I think is Dave Smith brought from the Intermountain Joint Venture, saying, we have these moving parts in place with these people. This is what we need the LCC to do for us. And I heard, and I can't even say this Northeastern Mahadanuch something, I don't think it was, I don't see the person, but anyway, High Peaks area. And again, they've already drawn a vision for what the conservation landscape of the future needs to look like there. Maybe that was Ken Enlow and the Northeast States folks. But the point is that completing a habitat system for the nation is really this series of questions. Where are we now? Where do we want to be in the future? And how will we get there? The role of landscape conservation cooperatives is being part of that and maybe participating at a pretty high level to empower those people to be delivering the work that we've already laid out. The Wildlife Habitat Policy Program has asked that we build on the existing conservation framework, that we do it together in a collaborative way. And the landscape conservation cooperatives provide us the ability to deliver science at a broad scale that has been missing for many of us who operate at different scales. I think the next important part of this is as we further build the habitat system for the nation, how will climate change affect this vision? In the face of climate change, what must we do differently to complete a habitat system for the nation? So I'm going to turn it back over to Mark, who's going to tell us about the National Fish, Wildlife, Plant, Climate Adaptation Strategy. Did I get it close? I love it. I'm glad plants are in there.
Thank you, Dennis. We are going to try and save time at the end for questions. We got a little bit of a late start, so if you'll bear with me, we'll go through this. Let's see. Oh, is it down here? Well, I got to close out. Okay. So I know we have a mixed audience. I gave a presentation Monday to the LCC coordinators and science coordinators, so if you're in the audience, you're going to be bored for a few minutes. Well, maybe you'll be bored for the whole thing, I don't know. But in the interest of the mixed audience, I thought I'd give everybody a little bit of background on the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy. So what we're going to do is talk about the current context for climate adaptation strategy at the federal level, and then talk about the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy, which is not just a federal effort, but is connected to the federal effort. We're going to talk about strategy implementation and the LCCs. Several points to make, but I do want to follow up on Dennis's presentation on this vision of having a national habitat system and completing it, and what climate change does to that vision now, and then we want to save time for questions and discussion. Well, the federal government is in the throes of quite a bit of climate change adaptation planning. I think for a period of time, federal agencies were not encouraged to engage with the issue of climate change. That changed with the advent of the new administration, and I think there was a feeling that federal agencies really needed to take a look at the issue of climate change and begin to think about how they would adapt their operations and their programs to continue to fulfill their mission in a period of climate change. The effort is really being overseen by CEQ and something called the Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. It has active engagement of over 20 federal agencies. They're in the process of implementing recommendations to minimize climate risks to federal programs and federal assets. The task force serves as a body for coordinating these efforts and for exchanging best practices, and they report on a regular basis to the administration. Last fall, the second of two reports were issued by the Interagency Climate Change Task Force to the President. This last report, last fall, actually recommended that there be an executive order to require all federal agencies to undertake adaptation planning and to have the first generation of their adaptation plans completed by this June. That executive order was executed and is in the process of being implemented. From this interagency task force effort, there have been several sectoral adaptation strategies developed. There's one that's been developed for freshwater resources, and this is mostly from a human drinking water, agricultural water supply perspective. It is not necessarily from an ecological perspective. There's also a related effort by the National Ocean Council, which is separate from the Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. But one of their major initiatives is to develop a National Ocean Policy Implementation Plan that includes an effort on adaptation to climate change and ocean acidification. And then there's the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy. The Wildlife Adaptation Strategy was actually mandated by Congress. It was required in report language to the 2010 Interior Appropriations Bill. That bill instructed CEQ and the Department of Interior to develop a nationwide, a national government-wide adaptation strategy. Obviously, as the Fish and Wildlife Agency of Department of Interior, Fish and Wildlife Service took the lead for the department's responsibilities, and we've worked in coordination with CEQ, and we, from the very beginning, invited NOAA and the National Marine Fisheries Service, and also state wildlife agencies to co-lead development of this strategy with us. All of you probably connected one way or another with wildlife conservation in the United States, and you know in our sector, federal and state agencies have to work together from the get-go if we're going to be effective. We also tried to build in a tribal perspective in the development of the strategy. The strategy focuses on preparing for reducing the most serious impacts of climate change to fish, wildlife, and plants. It was really started in January of 2011. It just went through a 45-day public comment period. That comment period ended March 5th. We're in the process of dealing with those public comments, and we think we're on schedule to deliver a final strategy by mid-June of this year. We're hoping that this thing will be implemented through a joint effort of federal, state, and tribal agencies. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. The strategy really has 7 goals, and none of these are novel. They're all goals of conservation, but now they're in the context of climate change. And the number one goal is to conserve and connect habitat. But we also need to begin to manage species and habitats with climate change in mind. We need to enhance the capacity of management agencies to deal with climate change. We think there's a big role for adaptive management in our efforts to adapt to climate change. We need to continue to support efforts to increase in knowledge and information on climate change because we don't know all that we need to know. We certainly need to increase awareness and motivate action, particularly on the part of the public, for climate change adaptation. And we need to continue to try and reduce non-climate stressors. What I really want to talk to you about today are some personal perspectives that I've drawn from this experience relative to the number one goal, which is to conserve and connect habitat, because it relates very directly to what Dennis was talking about. So in terms of strategy implementation, one of the first things we say in the strategy is this is not a strategy for the ages. This is 1.0. We think there needs to be 2.0 in 4 or 5 years, and 3.0 in 4 or 5 years after that. In other words, this is an iterative process. We've structured the strategy to identify actions that we can all begin to take in the next 5 to 10 years in the context of what science is telling us the natural world is likely to be in 50 to 100 years, and to do that iteratively. We are expecting that the agencies and the partners involved in the development of the strategy will integrate the actions and recommendations into their own plans and actions. We see a huge role for LCCs in the implementation of the strategy, but also for other regional collaboratives like joint ventures. We also see a big role for the state wildlife action plans in our efforts to adapt to climate change. And our first success to report is that CEQ, in its guidance to federal agencies on the adaptation planning they are to do, have required other federal agencies to consider and, to the extent possible, integrate the strategy into their own adaptation plans. So that's all agencies. That's that's not just Fish and Wildlife Service. That's Department of Transportation, Housing and Urban Development, et cetera, et cetera. We are recommending, we don't know that it will happen, but we are recommending that there be a federal, state, and tribal coordinating body. There's no new money to go with this strategy. There doesn't seem to be any new money for anything these days right now. But we think there needs to be an intergovernmental body to continue to promote the use of the strategy, to report progress on the implementation of the strategy, and hopefully to guide revision of the strategy in 4 or 5 years. And also to begin to engage our conservation partners more and more in the implementation of the strategy. I want to shift now to what are the implications of climate change for habitat conservation. And this is just a map of, it says protected areas of the lower 48 states. It's from Landscope. If you're not familiar with that, it's a great website that NatureServe has on biodiversity information. This is actually a map of public lands. There's some confusion in some quarters, I think, as to the degree of protection of some public lands. But at least this is the public estate that is protected to some extent for maintaining natural features. That amounts to about 30% of the national landscape. I will point out that this map does not include easements on private land. There are now about 30 million acres of easements on private land. I saw one presentation, I can't remember if it was today, yesterday. Somebody did have the newly developed map of conservation easement. It's really quite impressive, the amount of land that's in conservation status under easements. This is a roll-up of TNC's ecoregional plans. If you think about conservation planning, think about systematic conservation planning being the effort to identify the needs of virtually all species, identify some level of protection for them, some conservation objective, and then identify the areas on the ground that could provide that. That's systematic conservation planning. And there have been at least 3 generations, well, there's incipient 3 generations of systematic conservation planning in the U.S. I'll probably get this wrong. I'll probably make somebody mad. I think TNC's was the first that was national in scope. A second generation of systematic conservation planning were the state wildlife action plans. And Dennis had this map up as well. I like to think of this as, so I'm going to date myself here. And I'll probably get it wrong too because I'm not a techie. How many people remember the battle between 8-track and Betamax? Yeah, right? So I think the tech industry learned a lesson from that because now we have cell phone technology. Now we have 1G, 2G, 3G. And in theory, never works on my phone, but in theory, 2G absorbs 1G. 3G absorbs 2G. And I'm hoping in terms of systematic conservation planning that that's what's going on in this country. I know that many of the states did absorb a lot of information from TNC's ecoregional plans. So you could think of this potentially as 2G, systematic conservation planning in the United States. The question now, I think, one of the main objectives, as I understand it, of LCCs is to do collaborative landscape designs of the habitat that will be necessary to continue to provide a home to America's wildlife. So I think maybe we can think of that as 3G. And I think it would be great if it absorbed 1G and 2G and then added to it, hopefully, a consideration for the effects of climate. Well, by the way, these are the areas in common between TNC and the state wildlife action plans. So the first 2 generations of systematic conservation planning in this country have both identified these areas as conservation priorities. So while we're figuring out 3G and other refinements, it's probably a pretty good thing to be thinking about these as areas to work on. I'm going to excuse myself for one moment. Well, these maps have got to change because of climate change. And we've seen some presentations yesterday and today on the good work that's getting started in many quarters. Andrew Milliken gave a great presentation on what they're doing up in the Northeast to try and figure out what these maps need to look like in the future. So I got to swear you all to secrecy. I don't have permission to show this map. So I didn't show that map. But there are maps, they're out there. Good, smart people are working on them to try and figure out how these areas are going to need to change in light of climate change. And the reason I don't have permission to show that map, I'm sure I'll get permission to show that map, it's by Mark Anderson. He never answers his email, and I don't have his phone number. So what's climate change going to do to these maps? Well, I think in many ways, I always thought, maybe it's just me, but I'll throw this out there. I always thought of these maps as designs. They were designs for a national habitat system. They're not designs anymore, they're projections, they're hypotheses. Because as much as we can do sophisticated modeling, as much as we have 30 global circulation models, as much as we have 2 different methods of downscaling, as much as we can do climate envelope models for virtually any species, these are projections, these are predictions. Nature's going to do some things that are going to be different than the maps we draw. So it just needs to remind us that these maps are never final, they're never complete, they're a working tool. And we need to continually interact with reality and the data to determine how good they are. We spent a lot of time with the Wildlife Habitat Policy Research Program and the vision of completing a habitat system for the country. And I'm just a wild-eyed optimist, so I always believed we actually could do it until I came to grips with climate change and realized that completing it is an aspirational goal. We're always going to be working on this, in part because I fear that the changes that climate are going to make are going to keep changing that map a lot. And so even if we had the resources to complete it in a fairly short period of time, what we need to complete is going to change with time. I think one of the most profound things to come out of a consideration of climate change and habitat conservation is that the conservation value of a piece of land now is time dependent. And we, as a community, I think one of the organizing principles for us as a community is perpetuity, it's durability, it's the forever. And forever is pretty much gone. We heard in one presentation the other day, the concept of stationarity is dead. The idea that we may have annual variation in precipitation, but that variation's around a constant mean. We know that's no longer true. But I think on the land conservation side, we have to admit now that perpetuity is dead. The value of a piece of land or water for a conservation objective is time dependent. Now that may be a long time. It may be measured in decades or centuries, but it's likely no longer permanent. What are some of the other implications? One is that I think most conservation planning efforts, certainly 1G and 2G, started out with a consideration of natural vegetation and plant communities. We define wildlife habitat actually by plant communities. And so there's a national vegetation classification system. We use that. TNC uses it as a coarse filter in their conservation planning. Those communities are going to begin to break down because one of the sure things we know from the fossil record is in periods of climate change, species shift their ranges independently of each other. They don't move in communities. So what you get is new communities. So over time, as we have more and more climate change, our current communities are going to begin to break down, and we're going to see the formation of new communities. What that means in terms of long-range planning is that enduring features on the landscape that aren't going to change are going to become more prominent in terms of conservation value and conservation planning. And natural communities, as we define them today, are going to become less important. All of this increases the need for inventory and monitoring. I think right now, this is probably a bit of an overstatement, but hey, that's what these meetings are for, be a little provocative. I think we're kind of driving without headlights. We don't really have any programs that were designed to sense the change in distribution and abundance of fauna and flora in a period of climate change. Now, some of our programs, by good fortune or whatever you want to call it, are probably capable of detecting that signal to some extent. But I haven't seen any comprehensive consideration of the inventory and monitoring programs we have to give us a sense, do we have 60 amp bulbs? Do we have 100 amp bulbs? How much can we really detect the climate change signal? And we're going to need to be able to do that to continue to interact with the map and make sure that we're trying to protect the right places, as well as for many other things. All of this, this new dynamism and the fact that perpetuity is dead, also probably means that incentives and leases become more important in our conservation toolkit than they have in the past. Maybe more important in some cases than designations and acquisitions. We have spent, and we do spend, a lot of money on land conservation in this country every year. I don't think a drop of it's been wasted. I'd like to see more spent on it. But I do think going forward in a time of uncertainty, we may need to look at our toolkit. We may need to look at the allocation of our resources across that toolkit and ask ourselves the question, do we need to perhaps have our resources in programs that are a little bit more nimble than buying deeds or designating something for all time? So those are just some of the implications, I think, of climate change for our efforts to actually complete a national habitat system. In terms of LCCs and the role that we foresee for them in the strategy, the strategy uses a lot of terms. We use the term resilience. We use the term restoration. We try to qualify those terms because nobody honestly has a good definition of these things for a period of climate change. And that's one potential role that we see for the LCC network, particularly acting collectively as a network and not LCC by LCC. Help the conservation community define some of these terms: vulnerability, resilience, restoration. We hope that the LCCs will, in fact, be the 3G of systematic conservation planning, that they will develop a new generation of maps and that those maps will be more climate worthy than the maps that we have today. So continue to show America what conservation success could look like. I think there's incredible power in maps for a whole lot of reasons we don't have time to go into, but I'd be happy to talk with you on this side. Be creative. You know, we've never done this before, so none of us are really experts in it, and we don't have a great lot of history to draw on about how to do climate adaptation. So we've got to be creative. I tend to like uniformity and comparability, and those are sort of personal biases I try to control. But I also recognize that at this point in time, we actually do need to let 1,000 flowers bloom and then begin to do some selective breeding to get down to a few varieties because we don't know the answers. So we've got to be creative. But I do want to encourage the LCCs, while they're being creative, to also be cohesive. I think David Hayes made a great point yesterday. These things need to be relevant, and they need to be relevant in both directions. They need to be relevant to communities, to states, to partners, but they also need to be relevant at a national scale. One of the great things about the state wildlife action plans is that they exist. This really was, I think, a watershed event in conservation in the United States. If you didn't know much about conservation or conservation planning and you looked at this map, you'd just say, well, there's a lot of land. Seems to be more in Montana and Nevada that needs attention than anywhere else. But if you know something about this, these patterns reveal that not everybody defined things the same way. There are differences between Georgia and Alabama. There are differences between what Colorado did and what Wyoming did. And some states chose not to publish maps of their habitat priorities for whatever reason. So the power of this generation of planning to really affect national policy was limited by those two things, by the fact that some didn't participate in the identification of priorities. And for those who are responsible at a level above the state, the inconsistency presents difficulties in interpretation, in justification, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things I would really urge the LCCs to do is to, we're not in a position, for reasons I've already expressed, plus sociological reasons and political reasons, we're never in a position to tell everybody to do everything the same way. But I would encourage the LCCs at the network level to define some things they will do in common, so that there's at least a few things that they can show at a national scale to inform conservation action and conservation policy. And with that, I'm going to shut up, and that's going to leave us 10, 12 minutes for conversation. Now remember, you got to use the mic. Okay, if that means you're not going to ask questions, we'll repeat your question. No. No, seriously. Questions? Back there.
With respect to this document, completing a wildlife habitat system for the nation, is there a home for this? In other words, what I mean by that is if you don't have some central location that kind of manages it and perhaps brings all the money and the scientists and the managers together through some home, it tends to drift away as another document on the shelf, or it's so fragmented it can never really happen. So my question is there a home?
Well, no, I think Dennis or even Sarah is in a better position to answer. I'm a little disconnected from it now.
Okay.
Well, there's an immediate home for the research results, which is the Wildlife Habitat Policy Research Program website. And many of you have seen this, and it's showing up in a lot of forums, including today, by no accident. It has the website on there. So if you want to know specifics about the research that we did, the ones that relate to you or valuable to LCCs, they're at that website. They'll be there for an indefinite period of time. But if you want to know about the vision and where it goes and who owns it, I think part of the message is it is what we are about now. Do we recognize that, and we're going to build on it and build cohesiveness in that vision? How can there be, I think that is the step we're wrestling with now. How does a collaboration hold on to that as a group? At every level, whether it be local communities or states or ecological region, a joint venture geography, people are delivering on this vision now. How can we see it together? Who can help us see it together? It may be that one of the most powerful things that landscape scale collaboratives can do is to just periodically, regularly hold that up so we see that vision together, so we can all see where we are working together, to convene that dialogue. That may be a real powerful part of moving it forward. Does any one organization own it? I don't think so. Is any one organization going to represent this wholly? Not that I know of. It really is a question, is the broad conservation community going to rally behind habitat conservation that represents all that we want to have done? Everything that we want to do in the future for forest, fish, wildlife, and the plant systems that sustain them are in that framework. Mark talked a little bit about this being a time-limited thing. Many of us really struggle with the immediacy of getting that to be as full, maybe not complete, but as full as possible in the short term. But the point is, we're all part of it. It's not the conservation network is not owned by just the Missouri Department of Conservation or the Fish and Wildlife Service. The easements are not just Ducks Unlimited and other key partners, but all of us. It is a collaboration that will hold this vision together. How do we make that more real? Sarah?
And just to add to that, the program had a meeting in Annapolis in November of last year to bring together about 75 or 80 different conservation leaders from across the country from different sectors to answer that very question. Whose job is this now to make this happen? And one of the breakout groups came up with the idea that, these LCCs, are a new institution dedicated to landscape scale conservation. What better home for the vision of the National Network of Conservation Lands than the LCCs? And I think that some of the people really responded to that and yes, let's do it, and that makes great sense. And other responses, particularly in the West, where the LCCs might be seen as a little more independent, have not necessarily grasped the cross-boundary notion as completely as Northeast and Southeast. Maybe it'll be a tougher sell in the West. And then there's another kind of suggestion floating around that the Western Governors Association in the West, with the crucial habitats and the tools and all of that, makes a good place to continue talking about what the network looks like and what roles the different agencies and organizations might play in making it happen.
So one thing I'd point out to you is there are copies of that document throughout the room. If we run out, we can give you a website where you can go get it. But you can also go to that website and see any of the reports on any of the projects. If you have an interest in understanding what it might cost to actually complete a habitat network. This program, I think, did some pioneering research. It's the first time anybody's estimated what it might cost to actually protect these areas by various options. There was also even a study, I call it heroic forensic research, because an economist at Defenders of Wildlife went into 5 states and tried to figure out for a period of years where all the money went relative to the priorities that the states had identified. And frankly, both of the studies are very encouraging. This would cost a lot to do, but it's a fraction of what we spend on highways. And a lot of the money is hitting the maps. And there's probably a lot that we could do in implementation and policy to get more of that money to hit the map. So if you have an interest in the financial, economic dimensions of this, I really encourage you to go look at some of the papers on that website.
Thanks. Andrew Milliken with the North Atlantic LCC, and thank you both for presenting this, but also I think you're subtly, and maybe not so subtly, offering a challenge to the LCCs here that, you know, I'll admit I have an Eastern bias, but I think it's a challenge that we should take up. And it's obviously not my decision, but I feel like why wouldn't LCCs collaborate with the partners and partnerships in their own geographies and with the LCCs across the nation as a network to help develop landscape conservation designs that incorporate climate change? Why wouldn't we do that? Yeah. And the previous comment suggests one potential issue that we may need to address, but I guess I think this is really important that we talk about this at this conference and get some consensus on whether this is something we want to take on.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And I'd just point out I think it was the session in here before lunch, had 2 examples of where I think this is happening in the Northeast and the Southeast on a regional basis that's roughly in accord with LCC boundaries, but it overlaps a little bit, where the agencies, federal and state, are coming together and saying we need to do this regional vision and we need to make it climate worthy. So the way I think about it is I don't think we're issuing you a challenge as much as we see the LCCs as the next generation of this, the opportunity to improve this and make it climate worthy. If we're running a relay, right now you're our anchor guy. So it's, if that's a challenge, it's a challenge, but I think we see it more as a progression and a recognition of the great potential of the LCCs.
Yeah, I meant that in a very positive way.
Yeah. He took it that way. I'm kind of paranoid.
In the back here, Rick Carney with the Great Basin LCC and Fish and Wildlife Service. I want to just respond to Andrew's comment and maybe point out a little bit of something that's been missing from the dialogue thus far. And Andrew, I think the reason why we see some resistance in other parts of the country is the need to address values, the values of these lands. And if I pause and listen to the conversation thus far, I recognize that we are developing habitats for what? And establishing conservation designs for what? And until we get at the discussion, which is very value-laden, about what we want to conserve and how we want to conserve it, and what are the other elements in play in developing these designs and developing the habitat networks, that we'll continue to talk among ourselves, which is something we've done for too long.
Thank you, Rick. I don't have a response to that, but.
I'm Steve Fuller. I'm also with the North Atlantic LCC. I'm a collector of conservation planning frameworks. And what I like to do is look at them and find the similarities. And my collection has doubled or tripled in the last 2 days. But really, I can see that everybody's doing the same things, but using different semantics. And so some of these issues will be resolved when we can get common semantics about the stepwise process. What you just described in my collection is like step one, figure out what we're going to conserve. Some people call them targets, some people call them conservation elements, some people describe coarse filters and fine filters that will define the things that we're going to conserve, but we're all doing the same things. So I think this is our charge, but we have some barriers, and the barrier is finding the commonalities and not the differences.
If I may respond. Thank you. I promise to be brief, so give others a turn. I would suggest that we need to be reaching out to other communities altogether, the transportation planners, the agricultural interests, the power providers, and the full range of landscape users, because they're out there looking at things from their perspective based upon their values. And until we engage in dialogue and arrive at some general understandings of the need to blend the full suite of needs, that we will continue to talk among ourselves about what we do and pat ourselves on the back. But we really do need to engage with other communities.
Maybe I can speak from the transportation community side, but they really feel like they need from all of you what your priorities are. Because when they have maps like these, or better yet, the finer one that looks at the intersection of the two, then they can look at that for their 20-year plans. What we've been lacking in the environmental community for decades now by not having this is we've foregone having our resources of concern considered when they really should be. So by saying that the data are not good enough for larger landscape level analysis, we've basically forced or shot ourselves in the foot and just had project by project consideration. So all the people on the front lines at the transportation agencies, the energy companies, and the frontline Section 7 biologists, they're accustomed to looking at engineering designs and using species surveys. So what we're missing then is DOTs, transportation agencies, are required to do 20-year plans. By not having this, the environment isn't really considered on the 20-year plan. It's not considered when projects are budgeted 6 or 7 years before construction. That's just a huge loss. It's been noted by many that this is pennies on the dollar compared to the infrastructure costs themselves. So if we could just have the priorities identified, then they can include it in the project budget, and it's not such a big deal for them. But if we wait until after the projects are budgeted and do all this consultation in the last couple years when admittedly, finer engineering detail is available, it's not in the budget. And then it's a big argument, a big stress for the engineering manager because he has to deliver a project on time and on budget, and this stuff isn't in it. So at that point, it's a big deal. So I would say, please don't delay at all the integrated, the integration work that's occurring now and the priority identification. I'm convinced, also having worked on the local and the metropolitan regional level, that they will use this as soon as it's available. There's some great information from Virginia, the southeastern part of the state, where they did a combined benefits mitigation plan. They looked at needs for species, habitats, and wetlands. Just by having that available, they went from normally 3/4 of the investment in mitigation is related to wetlands. Now what's done under the 404 program is just 10 to 15% of the overall investment in conservation and restoration. So just by having these priorities out there, a lot of voluntary, collaborative, more local level, as well as federal agency work begins to come together. And it's all dependent on this. So don't delay.
Thank you. I want to alert you to the fact that we're eating into your break. By the same token, we're happy to stay and discuss. And before you go, I think we need to give ourselves a round of applause. I'm pretty sure. No, wait. You didn't let me finish why. I think we established the precedence of 100% compliance with the microphone policy. So, thank you.